That would be helpful so they can hear me. Hopefully you all can hear me now. All right. And so as I was just kind of sharing my journey, how I got here. And so, you know, I found myself curious about the experiences and I wanted to be part of the process to help. And so that led me down a journey of becoming a psychologist where now I'm able to sit with people to help them sort of come up with the language that they can use to be able to navigate their life experiences and also to talk about some of the experiences, some of the reactions, the emotions that maybe they've never shared before. And so that's the link here. We are going to talk a little bit about how language coincides with the mental health sphere. Is that okay? Now, you know, I talk to people for a living, so I'm used to people talking about it more. So please oblige me. I know it's been a great 2 days. So when we think about mental health, right, sometimes, particularly in the Black community, we think about mental health kind of depicted on that picture that's to my left, right? Sort of this idea of someone sort of under the cover looking stereotypically sad, not getting out of bed, things of that nature, right? But as time has kind of progressed, we've started to see mental health and we've started to see lots of celebrities come out and talk about mental health, right, in a different way. We've seen, hope you all know this person in the red, not me, her on the screen. Y'all know her? Yeah, so we've seen celebrities like Taraji P. Henson and Charlamagne the God. We've seen these different celebrities come out, Viola Davis, and talk about mental health. And so I share this so that as we're getting on the porch and sort of talking about the connection between language and mental health, that we start to recognize that really we can't always see the internal wounds externally, right? So mental health has different faces, and that's important to know when we start talking about language. So I'm going to ask you all to join me, if you are willing, to close your eyes for a moment. I'm going to take you behind the wall of one of my veterans that I used to work with, obviously maintaining his confidentiality. Before I was at Hampton University, I spent almost 10 years at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, working with military veterans, many of whom experienced trauma. And so I'm going to take you all behind the four walls, absolutely maintaining his confidentiality. So if you all would, just for a moment, close your eyes. Just be present for just a second. I want you to listen to the journey of William. William is a 65-year-old African-American Vietnam veteran, served and was drafted into the military, experienced significant trauma, significant loss. The effects of his military service were so difficult that he used mental health care as his last resort. He came in uncertain of the words to use, uncertain of the right language, uncertain how to even share his experience. He had received messages that it's not okay for men to be vulnerable. As a Black man, he had to keep going. As a Vietnam veteran, he had to push through and he could never tell a soul. But he decided that healing needed to be his priority, that emotional freedom was a gift that he could give to himself. So he allowed himself to use the language that he did not know that he had to move towards the healing. He used that language to recover from substance abuse. He used that language to be able to describe horrific experiences endured in Vietnam as a result of being drafted, a choice that he did not have. He was able to overcome his experiences, develop a healthy relationship with his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and ultimately chose using language to recover and to be able to no longer live a life of emotional bondage. This is the journey of William. I invite you all just to take a breath and kind of release that. And you can open your eyes back into this space And so I share that journey of William because oftentimes we are not privileged to go behind the doors of people who are willing to use the language to talk about their own experiences. And William is just one person. There are many who have taken that journey. And so like William, right, we know that the history of Black people have shaped our mental health, right? We know that slavery, we are still experiencing the effects of that. The psychological, the emotional pain still continues, right? We know that systems are trying to move forward, many of them, but there still continues to be systemic oppression that makes it difficult to navigate those systems. We know that psychology, while there are some amazing psychologists of color as well as allies in the field of psychology, the mental health field was initially founded by white men. And so their journey, their story is very different than those of William or Black people. And we also know that external messages, we receive external messages and internal messages that we take in, but messages from our families, right? From our heritage about pushing forward, about moving forward. And so all of these historical underpinnings really impact how we think, how we feel, and whether or not we seek help. Yes? Yes. All right, so let's keep going. So how does this sort of show up? So what we know, and the research supports this, cultural mistrust. We know that African Americans have higher levels of cultural mistrust, partially because of some of the experiences I just talked about. We also have lower levels of seeking help, with the exception of if there's a crisis, right? So my hip could be hurting for a long period of time, right? And I'm like, it's okay. I'm gonna keep going, right? And then all of a sudden I can't keep going to work anymore. And then I say, well, let me go to the emergency room, right? So, and part of that is messaging, because the messages push through, right? If you think back to slavery, push through, keep going. I saw mom and grandma and great grandmother do it. I'll be fine, right? This hip will be okay. Meanwhile, now we need surgery, right? And so oftentimes African Americans wait until there is a crisis to seek help, and that is rooted again in history. There's also historical data to support that African Americans have a higher likelihood of being diagnosed with what we call a serious mental illness. So those are going to be things such as diagnoses such as schizophrenia, depression, things of that nature. And so oftentimes that has kept many African Americans from seeking mental health care, right? Diversity in the field. So the helping professions, as Dr. Willis and Ms. Matthews shared, we know that we need more individuals of color in these fields. Representation definitely matters. And then we know that current and past traumas impact help-seeking behaviors as well. So James Baldwin helps us kind of understand and etch this point a little bit in stone. He says, people evolve a language in order to describe and thus control their circumstances, or in order not to be submerged by a reality they cannot articulate. So when we experience life, right? Life happens to all of us. And so when that happens, we try our best to find language, the best language we have in the moment, to be able to oftentimes survive. And so here's the power of language. Let's just do by a show of hands, right? Because we've been sitting for a long time. By a show of hands, how many of you have heard the statement, what happens at home stays at home? Okay, next one, boys don't cry, right? Men, even men, right? Men don't cry. How about Black people don't go to therapy, they go to church, okay? You have heard it here. You can do both. You can go to church and therapy. If you've never heard it before, I want y'all to know, Dr. Kristie said it, okay? The next one, you must work twice as hard to get what you want, right? We've heard these messages. And then the last one, what do you have to be sad about? I went through this, I went through this, hard times. What do you have to be sad about, right? So if you think about it, what are these messages inherently telling us? What are they saying, some of them?
Shut up and go to work.
Wow, so as this gentleman in the back says, shut up and go to work. Yep, anyone else want to add to shut up and go to work? Yes.
You don't have the luxury to give in to these feelings.
Wow, that's so powerful. You don't have the luxury to give into these feelings, right? And if we take that a step further, your emotions don't matter. Forget about them, right? Shut up and go to work, forget about them and keep going, right? Anyone else? Yes.
Put your problems in context slavery from.
Absolutely.
We're not there.
Absolutely. Just be happy with where we are, right? So even if I'm not happy, you need to be happy, right? And so this kind of shows the power of language and how this can impact us so much. And so the pandemic, as stressful and traumatic for many of us, if not all of us, that it helped us bring mental wellness to the forefront, right? We learned to start talking about mental health, many of us. We learned to find ways to identify language, our cognitions, which is just another word for our thoughts. We learned to start the process of recognizing how do we communicate, what is being communicated and what's not being communicated. And so I kind of break all of these kind of pieces down, the historical underpinnings, the recent pandemic, life stopping and us witnessing horrific incidents that were happening across the country with Black people being killed while all of us were stuck at home. I narrow these down to kind of the big three. And so when we break this down, we see that for many Black individuals, there's negative consequences associated with seeking help, right? So that stigma still exists, right? And that stigma comes from language. There's that social pressure against psychological help seeking, right? So those beliefs that we just talked about, right? If I believe that I have to just suck it up, or I can't cry, or my emotions don't matter, then when those emotions bubble up, that language that has been imparted in me is going to continue, and I'm probably not going to seek the help and care that I need. And then the last piece is just these perceived difficulties with seeking professional help, right? Just that concern that, will there be somebody that I'm sharing space with that will understand my experiences, right? Well, am I able to trust someone that looks the same as me or that looks different from me, right? Is it okay to be vulnerable? And so those are the pieces that really can impact as we think about language and the connection with mental health. These are kind of the big three that we see as kind of stuck points to helping to move forward in terms of seeking the help we need. And so I want everybody to say first person language.
First person language.
That was a little bit weak. Let's try again. First person language. Okay. So when we think about first person language, you all may have heard folks say, you know, she's so OCD and casual. Yes, right? You've heard that, right? And OCD means obsessive compulsive disorder. So when we think about language and describing mental health, we want to use first person language. So instead of saying she is so OCD, she's an individual who has been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. Instead of saying he or she or they are a trauma victim, this is a person who is a survivor of trauma. So we want to start infusing the person and using more humanistic language as we're talking about mental health. So what do? We've talked a little bit about some of these, but as you think about what do I do with all this information, right? How do I, take this out of here? These are some pieces that I want to encourage us to kind of take into consideration, right? So recognizing the cultural messages, the historical context that impacts mental health, right? Acknowledging the systemic hierarchies and talking about those. Looking at bringing in programming around mental and emotional wellness into the spaces that you're in, whether they're community agencies, whether you're working, whether it's the school system, and then being curious, right? Intentionally connecting with other students, people from other generations and other cultures to talk about the language and the messages that we've received that may be impacting our mental and emotional wellness. And so in practice, what that could look like, when I was at the VA hospital, we implemented diversity discussion groups. It started with lunch conversations, and then we wanted to formalize it, right? So that people felt like there was a space that was a brave space that they could actually have some of these conversations. Being comfortable with being uncomfortable, creating intergenerational spaces. It's so interesting to me. We recently did a group at Hampton with Black women in mental health. And in that group, one of the themes that emerged were, these 20, 21, I like to think of myself as young, but I'm like, gosh, not anymore. These 20-year-old, young women talking about how they've watched their mothers and their grandmothers be so strong, but they also are seeing symptoms of depression and symptoms of anxiety, and trying to balance the language, the messages of keep going, push through with but gosh, I want to take a break, right? Or I want to prioritize my mental health. And so I think those intergenerational conversations are so healthy and can be so helpful as we think about how we move some of these pieces forward. And then I challenge all of you all, and I think it is your responsibility as you're gaining this information, and we have some resources for you at the end. It's important to monitor your own language and to be okay correcting people. So the next time you hear someone say, that's so OCD, or they're such a victim, right? You can say they're a survivor of trauma, right? You can say, no, actually, here's a better way to say that. They did not attempt to commit suicide, right? They made a suicide attempt. Right? The language is so important. And so as we get ready to close, we're going to invite you all, hopefully you're willing to do an interactive activity with us. So I invite you to find a partner, preferably somebody you did not come in with. And this is for everybody. Those of you online, you are welcome to use the chat. This is completely voluntary, but I hope y'all won't leave me out here by myself. So feel free to stand up if you're willing and able, and find a partner, and you're just going to stand across from them. And for those of you online, you are welcome to do this exercise out loud. If you see someone walking around and they don't have a partner, please, we can create a trio. No person left behind. You just gave her away, didn't you? Gave me the go. Understood. All right, and so what you're going to do, this is going to help us close out and demonstrate the power of language and affirming the power of language. And so I'm going to invite you, it might be a little bit awkward and uncomfortable, but to look at the person in the eye or the people in your group as you're doing this. And you're just going to very confidently repeat after me. Everybody ready? Today, I honor you.
Today, I honor you.
I honor me. I honor life through my voice. My language matters. Every word that I think is powerful. Every syllable. Every consonant. Every vowel. It has power. My voice is light. To emphasize strength. To encourage my brother, to encourage my sister, to uplift the next generation. Today, I pay homage to the past. I look forward to the future. And in doing so, I commit to language that encourage, that loves, that promotes mental wellness. I commit to language that raises up the beauty and excellence of Black culture. And now I need y'all to take this last part from the depth of your belly. Today, I leave you with these important words. You are loved. You are worthy. You are brave. You matter and always will. Thank you. Thank you all for participating in that that display of language. And so what we will do, we will invite Rachel up and we will take questions.
Thank you all so much. That was such a lovely set of presentations despite this. But are there any questions in the audience for our presenters?
I do have a question. I'm a psychologist also, retired man. But one of the things that I found that running special education departments, most of the staff under me were white, the other professionals. And I found the bias in reports, and I know one of the things I required that I would review every report. and that I would get out the little red pen. And I found that you do that a couple times to somebody's reports and they know that you're actually going to read it, then they start shifting. Now, I don't know if it actually changed what was in their heart, but it changed what was on that paper that followed that child.
Yeah,
And that makes a big difference.
absolutely.
So, I mean, I really commend you three ladies because it is a real problem out there. And in the mental health field, you're right, we are so few. I mean, we're like raising that and
Yeah.
May I,
Thank you.
may I summarize that for the people
Oh,
who
yeah.
called in? So we have a lady in the audience who's a retired, mental health professional and psychologist and worked in special education, but she, recommended that, well, she shared her experience of reviewing the clinical notes of the people who reported to her and used her red pen to point out some of these notes and biases, and allowing those people to see. It's a short summary, but
Yes.
that is great. Thank you. Yes, sir. I think so.
Thank you all. It was so insightful. You know, that we can now come forward with a lot more help for our community in terms of mental health. I wonder though, I think that the question I have has to do with financing it. I always thought that mental health was a rich person's luxury, you know, and so the sister circle took a bottle of wine, the prayer with the pastor and the congregation was an offering. And I see that it's much more accessible, destigmatized now, and there's much more, there's some remedies as far as financing that help. But how do we, just deal with the fact that it is kind of unaffordable, and how can we get medical insurance companies to cover it more?
And before you get there, sorry, to summarize for the audience virtually, the lady in the audience is pointing out the financial barriers that prevent many people from accessing mental health services.
Although I said I thank you for the insightful.
Yeah, I think it takes progress. But I think one of the pieces that the pandemic did help us with is moving that piece forward. So we found that insurance companies were willing to now provide a certain number, time limited, right? Number of sessions of telemental health care services. We also find that there's a lot of Taraji Stevenson's foundation. They offer, usually it's 3 months to 6 months of free. I think I'm hearing somebody. Yeah, so I was just saying that we've definitely seen a lot of progress in that area, particularly with the pandemic, with insurance companies being able to provide telemental health services and being able to cover that under insurance, because at one point in time that wasn't the case, which is, I won't get on my soapbox about that, but nonetheless, but then there's other foundations, the Loveland Foundation, even Therapy for Black Girls, for example, even the Boris L. Henson Foundation, which is Taraji's foundation, who do provide, and there's specifically looking at communities of color and targeting those populations, and having network of licensed providers that are part of those populations to provide free therapy services. The challenge is that information is not always out there. So I think the education piece is a big portion of it. Insurance, I just think it's going to take some time for it to catch up, for them to be willing to provide free care, especially as nationally we start to see the rates of mental health conditions just continuing to rise. From a financial place, they probably just don't want to do that. But I will say there are resources out there, at least currently, to provide some pro bono services.
Medicaid provides it as a provision for it yet.
I don't know. I will look up for sure because I don't want to misspeak, but I'm not sure about Medicaid in particular. Yeah, no, thank you.
Yes, I have thoroughly enjoyed your all's presentation, and thank you so very much. And the question I have is that, listening to the percentage of Black speech language pathologists, what do you think that is even to the day?
right, thank you, wonderful question. Shana, you can come with me. Oh, yeah, so the question from the audience member was, why is the percentage so low for minorities? As I stated before, 92% white female, 3% Black, and I believe almost 8% overall for all minorities. And so our profession, if anyone has seen the movie The King's Speech, was historically white male. And so there was a shift, and again, the profession is white female, but there are many barriers. I think part of it in which Shana and I are very passionate about is the awareness of letting people know about health sciences. And so within our realm, there's speech language pathology, physical therapy, and occupational therapy. And those statistics are very similar as well. So I think a lot of times, I believe it's more of a pipeline in the sense that these health sciences typically aren't shared maybe as much as other majors such as business and psychology when you think about college fairs. And also just proximity of maybe not knowing someone in your family or community that looks like you. I often say you can't be what you can't see often. You know, there's that inspiration has to come from somewhere that you're inspired and you're able to achieve that. Again, there's also a financial piece as well for our profession that there are speech language pathology assistants, but typically to practice, you must attain your master's degree. So that's 6 years of schooling, you know, so also Shana.
And Linia touched on a lot of the barriers, but there is another barrier, which is, you know, in higher education programs. I do believe in the country there are 10 speech language programs that are at HBCUs, and then at other, you know, PWI institutions, there are other programs. However, I don't want to go into the statistics, but I will say that Black students are typically not admitted as often to certain programs, particularly if you're using GRE scores or, you know, those standardized measurements, things like that. We are having a lot of changes that are happening, you know, through advocacy and making sure that, you know, we look at those things, you know, GRE scores and things, and using other, you know, measurements of success. So definitely, I think the number of programs, and then are we being accepted to those programs? This is where a lot, you know, just to be quite frank, you know, some of that implicit bias that may be present. This is a field of communication, you know, so this is us and how we present, how we're talking, how we're communicating, and it's a medical science program. And we have stories upon stories of microaggressions and things that, you know, our students have experienced. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sir, in the back, I think you had a question.
Yes, I had commented a question. She was talking, I said, shut up and go to work. I was thinking, especially with Black men in my era, my father, he almost never, I've never saw him go to the doctor, and I know he was sick. When he was sick, he would drink a bottle of the whiskey, you know, a quilt at night, and in the morning, he'd get up and go to work. He died very young, and I just kind of remember some of the things from that era that I was in the military and their way of dealing with things, and you sort of take things with you. So Black men have to overcome a lot of things from families and from experiences. My question is this, though. If you look at corporate America, you see Snoop Dogg and Martha Stewart, and you think at one time Snoop Dogg was castigated, and now it's almost like, what is your take on this? As long as they're making money, it's all right to use your bodies. Also, the State Farm commercial with whoop, there it is. Yeah. And it was very popular, and you're looking at it, but if you're a child and you say, oh, this is great, how does that carry over? What's the downside to that? Thank
you. So the question or comment was about how Ebonics or African-American English or slang has become commercialized and more on a celebrity status becomes accepted. But we see that in all of Black culture, that it's not cool and it's marginalized until there is a profit.
Yes.
And so then it's cool. And so then that's when you are seeing merchandise. You can see sales, Black History Month, there are so many different stores that are participating in that. So to your point, sir, I believe that what we're doing now, telling our own stories, us taking back the narrative and finding power in that, and knowing that we don't have to have anyone to validate our language or our experiences, that often especially when it comes to music, I like when artists are underground, right? Because then when it becomes mainstream, they may change their image or feel like they have to shrink themselves in order to become accepted by the mainstream. And so I believe as a culture that we should celebrate that we are unique, from our language to our art to our poetry, but people profit from our pain. So the highlight reel is the commercial, whether it's cereal, there it is. But a lot of times there is a stigma attached to it first. And so I think within our families and our communities that we have to have those real conversations and be comfortable with ourselves, no matter what the public or the mainstream says.
And I would just like to add on that, even when they are making money off of it, it is only okay in certain settings. Snoop Dogg could walk into a certain setting and talk like that, but anybody else in this room, you would not be given any credence.
True. I think that in some cases, the narrative is starting to shift. I know for myself as a Black female professor who has a doctoral degree that I'm very comfortable at this time wearing my hair in locks, but I know that 10, 20 years ago, it may not have been acceptable. So I think it takes awareness, it takes allyship, in order to change those narratives and, not change who we are. Because when it comes to dialect, I can do both. I can, speak and, read literature and present and talk with my friends or speak at a conference, but it all makes me who I am, to not shrink myself to appease others.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I think we have time for just one more question.
Words do matter, and wonderfully, language is not static. And that's my hope, because personally, I have two granddaughters, 2 months old and 2 years old, and they are mixed, African-American, all the range. My daughter and my son-in-law is African-American. And I am stunned by the questions that I get about, trying to describe my granddaughters. And I'm thinking, I'm hoping I may not live long enough to see it, where we're so diverse that we don't categorize the way we are or the way we talk, because, language communication is, to me, primary in how you interact with people. And so hopefully our language will evolve enough to where, and, it keeps developing, where we can all somehow get over it.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
So when you are met with kind of that uncomfortable, crucial conversation, are you able to respond, or how is the response in that dialogue if you are met with those types of questions?
So it depends on the situation, how comfortable I am with the person asking. But I'm hoping it's an educational situation for them. If they seem if they seem surprised, I want to make it something you can learn. Or, you know, otherwise, it's a nice long story, and it's a wonderful story, the way they met in 11th grade math class, and so. But I've got a list of words that I'm starting to write down, because I'm thinking, I'm not even the most confident in how to express about my grandparents. It's something. And I wonder how many of us go through this.
I can't imagine the types of things you're seeing now since the advent of texting and nonverbal communication has become so prevalent, especially with young people. Are you seeing that there has been a trend towards being nonverbal or speaking, not knowing how to pronounce words that we grew up saying?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Generational.
The audience member was asking about, in the age of technology with texting, from a speech language pathology point of view, if we have seen a change. I will say just my observations and speaking about pragmatics, the social rules of language, manners, eye contact, things of that nature can be stripped away the more that our heads are down in our phone. And so again, those are those constructs of language, the nonverbal piece that is learned behavior. And so I know there are a lot of studies looking at developmental delays as well as just early childhood education and how COVID-19 had an impact on not having those social skills being developed because of the COVID babies being at home and not maybe in a typical daycare. So I think just the way that we relate to people, that has changed, I think, overall post, well, we're still in the pandemic in a sense, but yes, I think that the pragmatics definitely has been significant. Oh.
I think Dr. Willis, she had already pointed about pragmatics.
Or spelling too. Yes, I'm just a shorthand.
And I want to just, reemphasize that language, it does incorporate so many things. It incorporates the nonverbal, or limited verbal communication. It incorporates, our social skills. All of that is a part of language. And so hopefully today you felt equipped or, with some of these ways of changing your language so that it can now direct or reframe some of the narratives that have been pervasive in our country. So I'm not closing, but if you have questions later, please feel free to come to us and speak with us. Yes, sir.
Question, but I know, and we probably said it before, but I used to get a lot of criticism about tone of voice. About I had a very strong, powerful voice, and I was always told to soften it when I talk to people,
Yeah, it's how people perceive us before, it's perceptions all over. Same for me, my voice is quiet and I'm often perceived as, they diminish me. Are you sure you're a speech therapist? But, yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for attending virtually and in person. And thank you.